research interests include the integration of psychology, neuroscience, and theology. And so today she is going to talk to us about the alternative medicine, which you know is becoming more and more popular. But that being popular doesn't mean it must be good or even it must be bad. And you may wonder if the Bible has anything to say about this. So more on this topic by Dr. Robin.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks also to West End Baptist, did I get that right? Okay. For hosting me today. And Halifax even managed to put on some great weather for my arrival today. So aside from being sponsored by the Templeton World Charity Foundation, I assure you that I have no other commercial interest or sponsorships for this talk. So when it comes to alternative medicine, I'm sure everybody in the room has a story, either positive or negative, and there are probably as many different opinions on it as there are people in the room. You are probably aware that it's becoming increasingly popular. And because of all the different opinions and different things you hear, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of misunderstanding around it. So the concerns about its efficacy, does it work? There's concerns about scientific basis, and there might be some concerns about spiritual roots. There's also, as with many things, economic, political, and ideological agendas associated with alternative medicine. Consequently, it requires careful evaluation, I believe, from both scientific and Christian perspectives. And if you're looking for easy answers, well, maybe you should leave now, but don't. So in addition, I think that understanding some of the reasons for its popularity can help us as Christians know how to respond wisely. So let's first of all think what it is. So here are a few examples just from the internet. And as you can see, it's widely varied. And that's part of the confusion. It means different things to different people. However, before we get to the definition, I'd like to consider some of the historical and cultural context, bearing in mind that medical science is constantly changing. So here's a short history of medicine. You can read this. So it's important to consider that some things that were considered traditional are now considered quackery, and vice versa. Some things that were considered quackery have now become traditional. Water therapy would be one example of that, where people used excessive amounts of water to treat something, and we now know that drinking approximately 8 glasses a day is healthy. Much of complementary and alternative medicine, abbreviated as CAM, actually predated contemporary medicine, and it's making a revival in recent times. It has a lot of roots in Eastern philosophy versus contemporary Western medicine, which has more of its roots in ancient Greece. And interestingly, the topic is really only important from a Western perspective. Bear in mind that a large proportion of the world population have no access to medical care or contemporary medical care. What North America calls alternative medicine is actually traditional in 80% of the world or so. Again, considering historical perspectives, in pre-literate societies, there was actually no distinction between religion, medicine, and magic. So in the Middle Ages, for instance, medical care, as many people know, was delivered in monasteries, often by clergy. During the Renaissance was the rise of rational medicine, and Da Vinci, we're all familiar with, I'm sure, and his fascination for the human body. Scientific revolution of around the 18th century changed things in the development of scientific methods, and Francis Bacon. Interestingly, it was William Harvey in the early 17th century, and he was the first person to figure out the circulatory system in the body. His work was the first that did not have any reference to the supernatural. With a lot of the exploration and immigration at the turn of the 19th century, there's different types of medicine mixed. So in the West, it is thought that homeopathic and naturopathic medicine arose from reactions to the largely ineffectual and toxic conventional treatments of the day, such as, and here's some horrific pictures, such as purging, bleeding, treatment with heavy metals, such as mercury and arsenic, treatment with opium and heroin, and which is making a comeback, as you may know today. Before the 1960s, CAM was rejected by most people as quackery, but there's been an explosion of renewed interest and favorable interest since about the mid-20th century. So let's talk in terms of definitions. So this is from the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. And sorry, I didn't have time to look up the Nova Scotian ones to be local, but I suspect they're similar, or they may not even, not every organization even has a policy statement. This definition is actually based on the US one from the National Center of Complementary and Alternative Medicine, which has been renamed the National Center of Complementary and Integrative Health. All these acronyms get quite confusing. So you can read these. So in general, alternative is in place of versus complementary is in addition to. So complementary is sort of a more conciliatory term. And then the latest one is integrative, which seeks to unite all forms of healthcare into a coherent system. And here again from the website you can read, but note the bias, particularly in relationship to religion. So in this particular one, the traditional Western sees the body just as a machine, whereas alternatives sees the body as a whole. And treatment is just sick care with its whole health. So often the language that's used is biased. So that's something just to be aware of. And the change in language over the years has been interesting as well. So initially it was alternative. In the 1980s, it was holistic. And even that term, there's an implicit critique of traditional medicine. So way back when it was this very negative quackery, and then it became more unorthodox or questionable, unconventional, which are sort of a little bit more neutral, and alternative. So again, there's sort of the importance of culture, marketing, etc. So in terms of types or categories of CAM, this is from the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health I mentioned. So they just have two categories. Natural products such as vitamins and mind-body practices such as yoga, relaxation techniques. But note within these that there's quite a wide range. So people don't often, put chiropractic care and prayer in the same category, for instance. And interestingly, and this again shows the marketing and evolution, there used to be 5 separate types. They basically separated what they call energy therapies from manipulation, like chiropractic. Also, this idea of whole medical systems reflects an underlying religion or worldview, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So by moving it from the 5 and sort of getting rid of the energy medicine, they're sort of despiritualizing or neutralizing any spiritual connotations of some alternative medicine practices. A group of Christians wrote a book on basic questions on alternative medicine, and their categories are quite harsh, I think. So they've got complementary and down to quackery and fraud. So just even looking at the diversity of categories tells us that we need to be cautious in our interpretation. We need to avoid generalization. You can't talk about CAM in one big lump because they're all very, very different. Some things such as exercise are merely non-pharmaceutical, well-established therapeutic preventative medical practices. Others, such as in taking the herb pennyroyal, are potentially dangerous. Others, such as Reiki or therapeutic touch, have underlying worldviews that are contradictory to both medical science and Christian belief. So let's think about how we should evaluate these. So I think we should neither uncritically adopt nor completely dismiss all CAM treatments. Like I said, avoiding generalizations. Just because something's old doesn't mean that it's good. Just because something's new doesn't mean it's good. Just because something is from the East doesn't mean that it's evil. Just because something's natural doesn't mean that it's safe. We need to consider the absence of evidence versus the evidence of absence. So let's talk about what's good about CAM. So I think what's good is it does include a spiritual component. It puts ownership on the person to take responsibility for their health, broadens our perspective, points out the importance of attitude, of our mind on our body. It also helps point out some of the limitations of Western medicine. And in general, there are checks and balances in place. So again, the CPSO and the Canadian Medical Association all have policy statements about physicians who might practice. Even most CAM practitioners will have guidelines such as, attend to emergencies first. So what might be bad about it? These are critiques from a website called christianinformation.org. Some of these are a bit old, but still helpful. So what's bad is its unscientific approach, claims to manipulate energy to bring about healing, uses therapies that are unknown to the medical establishment, claims an extremely high cure rate. It's based on testimonials alone, as opposed to scientific evidence. Also uses spiritual language or adherence to gain credibility. The practitioner's qualifications are often questionable. There can be a failure to properly diagnose and treat, and I'm sure we've all heard some horror stories about children dying of infections because their parents didn't take them to hospital. There's a possibility of emotional harm, and particularly I see this in faith healing, where people are not healed because they have a lack of faith. It can be a waste of resources, and there could possibly be an increase of toxic effects on the body. So what is the evidence for it? So generally there's more evidence for the biologically based therapies than other forms of CAM, although that could also be because of the nature of how you do studies. Some things are not amenable to scientific study. I'll get to that later. The well-known gold standard for summarizing medical research is called the Cochrane Database of Systematic Reviews, and it has very, very strict criteria. So it's come up with a few products such as cranberry supplements to prevent urinary tract infections, omega-3 supplements for cardiovascular prevention, flaxseed, turmeric. Actually, there's a new study showing ground flaxseed is effective for treating high blood pressure as well. But see your doctor first. They also list many products where they say that there's insufficient evidence to recommend you to neither recommend nor advise against use of a particular therapy. And this could be due to lack of studies or poor quality studies. There's also concerns about the type of research done in CAM. So there's concern about the quality of the studies, also something called the file draw effect. So only positive studies are published. That can happen in regular medicine as well, though, no guarantees. It's often reinterpretation. So therapeutic touch, for instance, can be said, well, it at least provides comfort. So it's still good, even though there's no evidence of its healing. Often misleading terms are used. So for a lot of these therapies, they'll say it's used for, and then list all these things a particular therapy is used for, as opposed to that it actually is evidence supporting its effectiveness. Also, the problem of the halo effect. So one thing is found helpful for one condition, and then people will apply that one thing more broadly than it should be done. Also, there's often an authority bias, and that's where we've, I'm sure, seen on TV various celebrities endorsing CAM. People think, oh, well, if so-and-so uses it, must be good. And by the way, these same critiques apply to the prayer healing study. So Christians, unfortunately, are not immune from some of the biases in research. However, the gold standard for medical science is evidence-based medicine, and this isn't perfect either. So it's based generally on randomized controlled studies, where there's, a control group and an experimental group, and research is often double-blind, so people don't know which study group they're in, etc. The problem with this is, like I said, not everything can be measured that way. Our knowledge is constantly changing. There can be gaps between science and clinical practice. So when I'm with a particular patient in my exam room, what's found on a population-based study may not be applicable. It ignores, you can't always apply something from the group to the individual. It ignores things like somebody's personal meaning, their morals, their values. It ignores it's difficult to measure the importance of the therapeutic relationship on healing. There can be a lot of vagueness in the studies as well. For instance, defining health is notoriously difficult. And then there's the very interesting placebo effect, which was known in the 10th century. So most randomized controlled studies are done to comparing a drug, for instance, with a placebo. So by the very nature of the studies, they can't study the effectiveness of a placebo. It's thought that, but it is a well-known, well-documented phenomena. It's thought to be likely related to effects of relaxation, possibly some neurochemicals, but nobody's 100% sure. And there are some explanations for the placebo effect, such as belief, classical conditioning, you may remember from basic psychology, emotional support. People will, just being involved in a trial itself will help people feel better. You can't control if people are using other treatments as well. Some diseases resolve on their own, and this is very interesting. It's called spontaneous remission, and there's actually a spontaneous remission project database you can look up, and there's no limit to the type of diseases that can resolve on their own. There's been a lot of interesting books written on other things like laughter, happiness, the effects of love. So there's sort of a summary of the placebo effect. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about spiritual roots. Now, a lot of this is based on Candy Gunter Brown's book called The Healing Gods, and she's a historian of religion. So she talks about some of the Christian responses to CAM. So it ranges from it's all evil to it's all good to this middle that, well, we can make it good by rebranding it as Christian. So it's kind of amusing. People say to take labels of Christian yoga, for instance, and then they rename poses such as Holy Roller or Noah's Arch. Many CAM therapies have underlying spiritual assumptions which they don't disclose. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, let me be clear, but it's the not disclosing it, not being clear what it is that I think is a concern. People tend to focus more on how or whether something works as opposed to why it's supposed to work or the underlying theory behind it. Many people, Christians included, think that science is just neutral, or they might think in a negative way that it's materialistic. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but that's where I direct you to the CSCA for a lot more information. We talked about some of the terminology like holism used a lot in CAM, which is very similar to monism, which is a spiritual belief that all is one. A lot of this is like New Age spirituality. A lot of therapies assume some sort of a universal life force or vital energy. And again, the terms have very positive connotations. So many of them relate to the general concept of metaphysical religion. You can read that definition. So in general, metaphysical religions are non-personal, and they assume that there exists some sort of a spiritual power that can be manipulated. So New Age spirituality, it's not really new, it's just a repackaging of Eastern mysticism with some occult concepts thrown in. And it claims that we are emanations of God. Now, again, there's variations on it, but I'm just saying in general. It assumes that the divine is within you and you are immortal. You're a soul inhabiting your body. Therefore, you can travel outside of your body. You can read other people's minds and glimpse the future. A lot of these religions believe that angels protect us, no random coincidences, only divine interventions. Evil is not real. Fear, loneliness, and pain can be dismissed. In fact, given positive attitudes, optimum health, serene bliss awaits us. So what's the difference between New Age spirituality and Christianity? So bear in mind that life energy is not the same as the Holy Spirit. God is a personal being, not an impersonal force. In addition, we are distinct from God. We may have the Holy Spirit indwelling us, but we are His creation. We're not all one. The fact that God creates and God loves us implies a duality. We live within a directional, purposeful history. So homeopathic, naturopathic, and chiropractic medicine all arose from 19th century European and American schools of metaphysical thought. In fact, the founder of homeopathy and its American popularizer were both Freemasons. Naturopathy teaches that cosmic forces from within and without provide healing. So even in something like aromatherapy, for instance, it's thought that healing energies from plants can transfer spiritually to the person inhaling the scent of an essential oil. And this is Candy Guntis-Brown's comment on chiropractic. So the founder of chiropractic was a spiritualist who emphasized innate intelligence and taught the unity of all religions and all forms of healing. Other CAM therapies are based on Chinese, Hindu, and Buddhist beliefs. And what many Christians don't understand is that a lot of religions are non-creedal. So they're more embodied as opposed to word-oriented. So the medium is the message. So yoga, for instance, which originated with Hinduism, is based on the beliefs in the self as divine. Namaste roughly translates as, I bow to the God within you. Assumes connection with vital energy, which is named prana. By the way, different terms are used. So prana is the more Indian term, whereas chi or ki is the Chinese term for this vital energy. It's so the vital energy and this idea of reaching higher spiritual realms, often with sexual associations. And it includes positions that symbolize Hindu beliefs about achieving universal consciousness. So the physical and the spiritual cannot neatly be separated. So are there evil spirits underlying CAM? So a colleague of mine, Lawrence Burkholder, believes yes. He thinks that, and that's his book. And by the way, a little commercial interlude. If you are interested in understanding evil, I have a couple of my more popular level books for sale here. End of commercial. Back to evil spirits. Burkholder, he thinks subtle energies are demonic, and he defines subtle energy would be similar to the vital energy I talked about. He says it denotes energy that exists outside ordinary or positive space-time frame, such as magnetic electric energy. So a person is typically seen as this web of interlacing energy fields, and sickness and wellness are measures of how these energies function within a universe, which is itself a vast network of energy fields. So therapeutic touch, acupuncture, and homeopathy are three popular modalities that are based in subtle energy ideology. However, energy healing fails the test of the scientific mechanistic paradigm, according to Burkholder. I think we could be a little bit more open, but wait, I'll get back to that. He also claims the New Testament disavows any use of Jesus by subtle energy and warns against false demonic signs and wonders. So, how can we evaluate this again? So, Candy Brown is quite critical of evangelicals. She claims that Christians are bought into what the Old Testament classifies as idolatry. Often, practices initially rejected by Christians are accepted when they become more popular in the general culture, and that goes for a whole lot of things. So people often recategorize these practices as non-religious, even though they may be generically spiritual. She suggests that when people consider using CAM, they typically ask whether the practice will work to improve health or relieve pain. They really ask why the practice is supposed to work. She suggests that performing practices associated with religious meaning may actually instill religious beliefs. So many people may initially try CAM for non-religious health-related reasons, but over time they may come to embrace CAM's religious concepts. However, I think she's a little bit too critical. She does admit that not all therapies have religious basis. So she says there are some herbs that just simply used for their biomedical properties as opposed to herbalism. But there's a lot, as I mentioned before, that's ambiguous. Definitions are fuzzy, as I mentioned before. Many individual practitioners now may not even be themselves aware of the spiritual roots of their therapy. So I suggest that some, but not all forms of CAM may represent metaphysical religion. Some, but not all, subtle energies may be the work of evil spirits. The problem is it might be difficult to know the difference between herbs used as medicine and herbs used as vital energy. I don't think anyone who enjoys the scent of a flower is necessarily practicing vitalistic medicine, or any child that naturally does like a downward dog yoga kind of pose is necessarily practicing yoga. So many and there's a lot of overlap now. So there's many physiotherapists who use manipulation techniques that are similar to those of chiropractors, and many chiropractors advise exercises similar to what physiotherapists do. Many fitness classes use stretches that are similar to those of yoga, but they don't necessarily have all the other associations. Many things can also lose their religious association over time. And I'm sure many of us know that Easter was originally a pagan festival and has now become Christian. But the problem is, at what point do you make that decision? How do you know, with each individual practitioner, it could be different. And that's where we really need to, A, be educated and B, rely on discernment through the Holy Spirit. So let's talk about the popularity of CAM. Now, I actually had this cartoon before I knew we were having pizza. So. And they're actually wrong. There's probably more than 600,000 websites now. And they show that about 30 to 60% of the users of CAM are women, the elderly, and wealthy. And wealthy makes sense given the cost of some of these. Supplements are the most commonly used form of CAM. CAM is popular even among children, and here's a 2012 study. So the most common reason for use is sort of general wellness, and pain relief is general as well. So we talked briefly about the Christian adoption of CAM. And this was more in the 80s and 90s, a lot of spirit-led diet and exercise books and videos. So the Maker's diet, some of you may have heard of, emphasized eating biblical food just like our ancestors did. A patient once gave me I call it a Christian New Age book basically, but it's talking about spiritual roots of disease pathways to wholeness. And they suggest that hypothyroidism or an overactive thyroid is only an anxiety problem, not related to thyroid. They suggest we have allergies because the devil destroyed our immune system because of fear, anxiety, and stress. So there is a lot that's way out there. Or they suggest that leukemia is caused by deep-rooted bitterness from unresolved rejection by a father. So in general, usage of CAM appears out of proportion to its scientific and clinical support. So we have to ask why. I suggest 4 reasons. First of all, is that conventional medicine is limited, particularly when it comes to complex illnesses like cancer and other chronic diseases. Medical care is also often fragmented, time limited, because there's so much demand. I don't know a lot about Nova Scotia, but certainly in Ontario, doctors are overworked and underpaid, and there's just limitations on time. Whereas alternative practitioners can spend half an hour, or an hour with somebody. Stress and common lifestyle-induced problems, chronic fatigue, depression, don't always find sympathetic ears or the time to listen, or easy solutions in the doctor's office. And in fact, we're trained to be conscientious and admit what we don't know, and that contributes to the popularity of alternative therapies. So physicians may, go through the pros and cons and says, well, this medication has a 50% chance of working, or it might or may not, whatever. And so we appear to lack confidence by giving all the information, as well as the necessity of informed consent and people knowing all the risks and benefits. This is particularly true. I often prescribe medications to people, and they'll come back, I didn't take it because I read all the side effects that the pharmacist gave me. And they may all be, 1% incidence, but people don't always understand, and they don't want all those side effects. So, whereas, and as I mentioned, because of this, then we can't employ the power of the therapeutic relationship, the placebo effect, the expectation and healing that can lead to healing itself. Whereas alternative practitioners are brimming with optimism. A second factor for its popularity, I believe, is our current social climate of consumerism and entitlement. People want to have it all, and they want to have it now. They want to have it my way. And again, I'm all about people being informed, making choices, but these choices need to be well informed. You may have heard of medical tourism is now the popular thing where people will go to other countries to get a treatment regardless of whether it's effective or not. People in a panic want to try absolutely anything. And again, Christians are not immune to this consumerism. Even research on religious benefits of religion can be prone to consumeristic influences. Thirdly, marketing strategies. I mentioned earlier about some of the marketing strategies with CAM, and making it more mainstream by despiritualizing it, using neutral language. There's a huge consumer demand, that consumerism I mentioned. There's an ambivalence towards modern medicine. So CAM is marketed as being better than biomedicine alone. So it becomes another commodity in a secular marketplace. Candy Brown talks about purging the toxins of modernity. The terms natural implies that conventional medicine is unnatural. They use scientific language, and even the idea of helping the body heal itself, where people don't realize that's actually a lot of what conventional medicine does anyway. And a lot of what we do is actually, I often find as an aside, I'm sort of caught between the two extremes of people who don't trust medicine. and they'll go to the alternative practitioner. And then the people who don't want to take care of their health, and I spent so much time counseling about good nutrition and exercise and spiritual health and dealing with stress, and people say, oh, just give me a pill. So we have that on the one hand. And then we have, if something goes wrong, doctors are the first people they blame. They don't necessarily blame the herb they took. No, it's all the doctor's fault. Finally, I think another reason for the popularity of CAM is that the spiritual void. There's a deep and widespread spiritual hunger right now. So, and even people who have a particular tradition, they may turn to things like transcendental meditation to fill the gap in their own tradition. Some people find that any spirituality is better than none. There's also a lot of disillusionment with the Christian church. A lot of people view conventional medicine as primarily espousing a materialistic worldview. So how do we respond to this? So here are some sort of practical common sense approaches. Consider the risk-benefit ratio. Consider what the patient is interested in, education, ethics, informed consent. So you could do a sort of a checklist. And I would add to this, does the patient want it? So thinking in terms of ethics, think about what might be wrong with this slide. And it's it's ancient, but it's still used today. So again, you have to be careful with anything that's too simplistic. You have to always be thinking broadly. In a Christian worldview, we are actually called to develop nature, to develop creation, take care and tend and keep the garden, basically, not just rely on the garden to heal us. Anyway, that was a little bit of an aside. So, and it's a nice picture anyway. So Candy Brown is particularly concerned about the lack of informed consent. So she talks about, in the States anyway, I should mention her research, therapeutic touch used by a lot of nurses and think, oh, well, it's non-invasive. However, if they're doing it assuming that there is such a thing as energy fields, then they actually are invading that person's energy fields. So that's where the practitioners need to be responsible in educating what the philosophy or whatever is behind the basis of their treatment. And then consumers need to be responsible in finding out as well. So we need to consider personal autonomy. We need to consider religious equality, self-determination. So just like medical doctors are called to explain the procedures and medications we recommend and any of the evidence behind it, CAM practitioners should also disclose the rationales behind their practices. She suggests that if the same logic were followed for CAM as for Christian prayer, or if the law equally protected and restrained both sets of practices, neither would be funded by the public purse. So let's consider a Christian approach or perspective. So first of all, just generally, the relationship between science and faith. Science, as I mentioned, is never fully objective. Data are theory-laden is a famous quote. When you do any study, you have an agenda behind it, which is okay, but it needs to be, that awareness needs to be there. Viewing science and faith or science and belief as separate can lead to compartmentalization. So a health care can be seen as completely separate from Christian belief. So people might go and ask for prayer healing, one day and then go to the doctor the next, and they don't see any connection between the two. And as I mentioned, in fact, Christians are called to investigate God's creation, to develop technology and work with God in healing, and to respect all humans as reflecting the divine image. We also need to consider a view of truth. Is all truth God's truth? There can be varying interpretations on this. I like to think instead that truth should all be examined through the lens of Christianity. And I suggest, as I mentioned, careful discernment rather than rejecting all or adopting all or relabeling it. We need to question, does the Holy Spirit only operate in the Christian community? Is it possible the Holy Spirit is working through other religions and in other CAM therapies, for instance? We also need to look at ourselves. Are all Christian endeavors good? Are they all valid? And many theologians are critical of religion research. Religion, as I mentioned, can be shaped by consumerism. Think about how worship music changes, for instance. Richard Sloan, he's primarily has done research on religion research, basically, religion and health research. So you can read his quote there. So third is the problem of idolatry that Candy Gunter-Brown mentions. When we think about science, for instance, or materialism, we're not using obvious forms of idolatry. You know, we're not building golden calves. Sorry, time? No? Okay. So they're not as obvious. They don't announce themselves as religious. They announce themselves as completely neutral, but they can have religious agendas behind them. I would say the idea of wanting a quick fix is a form of idolatry. God doesn't give hard and fast rules. Our faith is relationship-based. Yeah, we are called to be stewards of our own health, as well as the health of others and our world and our community, but we need to be responsible stewards. Society often has difficulty dealing with death, for example. So cancer patients are common users of CAM. What's the church doing? Where's the caring community of fellow believers? Now, I'm not saying, there are many churches that do an outstanding job of this. I am don't want to generalize, but I'm just saying it's areas that we need to be thinking about where we can improve on. Theologically as well, there's extremes of glorifying pain in a way and thinking that suffering has a divine purpose to it, versus the other extreme of denying any pain, such as things like the prosperity gospel, saying, well, we all deserve to be healthy and wealthy. And you can read Brown's quote there. So suffering is inevitable, but it's not necessarily caused by God. And this is a whole another topic for 5 other talks. But very briefly, like Karl Barth's quote on this. And if you're interested in reading more on understanding healing, I have an article on Fuller Magazine, and it's online at Fuller Studio. I can give you the website if you're interested afterwards. So we need to consider health, and it's actually the Greek term relates to salvation. We need to think about healing in the Bible, and again, I talk more about that. And finally, we need to educate people, as I've mentioned. So, again, a sort of a Christian checklist. Can it be recommended with integrity? What are its spiritual roots? Could it potentially foster New Age beliefs? Are there any spiritual dangers? Does its practice include occult practices, which could open the doors to evil spirits? What's the role of the church in prevention of illness? And that's broad in terms of environmental care, social justice issues, education about the relationship between science and faith, which is what the CSCA aims to do. And then more specifically about CAM. And I think I would just do this very briefly so that we have more time for questions. But I suggest that the failure of Christianity has contributed to Western Christianity has contributed to the popularity of CAM. Much of our modern Christianity, Western Christianity, has failed to address experiential and affective aspects of personhood. So there's an emphasis, as I mentioned, on black and white, emphasis on doctrine, emphasis on words. There's a neglect of metaphor, imagination. There's a neglect of talking about the ambiguity in our faith and our lives. And this has led to a hunger for more holistic approaches. And it's a big book, but I highly recommend Ian McGilchrist's a book called The Master and His Emissary. And he just briefly talks about how the right hemispheric processes, which allow for broad attention, seeing things as a whole, considering imagination, relational, non-literal aspects of language, has been neglected in Western culture. And the left hemisphere, which is the more logical, categorical, using explicit reasoning, has been prioritized. Okay, sorry, I'm just going to skip some of this. He suggests that both hemispheres have important roles, but they've long been in conflict. He thought there's better balance in the ancient world in the Renaissance period, and then with the Industrial Revolution, Scientific Revolution, the balance has been lost. And with left hemispheric dominance, religion becomes mere utility. Our brains shape our world. Emphasis on science leads to a neglect of right hemispheric perspective on the world. We need metaphor and imagination to truly understand the world. And by the way, my research, I use a lot of metaphor, imagination. So actually, in contemporary theology, there is a recovery of the use of imagination and figurative language in general. But how are we bringing this into our churches? Do we want to have more time for silence in our churches, practicing the presence of God? In fact, many practices, spiritual practices with long tradition in the Christian church have some similarity to CAM, such as breath prayers, some forms of mindfulness, and actually I also have a chapter on mindfulness coming out. I've probably confused you all more than when you first came in. Sorry, not really. But it's not black and white, and they are not easy answers. We may need to make decisions in the context of our ongoing relationship with our Creator and Redeemer. In order to make wise decisions, I suggest that we be knowledgeable about scientific evidence. We don't all need to be scientists, obviously. But we need to be knowledgeable about possible spiritual underpinnings of treatments. We need to be aware of our own susceptibilities to consumer marketing, our desires for instant relief. We need to ask ourselves why CAM works and ask ourselves why we're seeking it. Religious leaders, as I mentioned, need to educate, both about the science-faith relationship and about other religions. We need to develop nuanced theologies of sickness and suffering, as well as compassionate care for the suffering. Should we be considering church fitness classes instead of church potlucks? As I mentioned, should we have more contemplation time? So I suggest that our theologies need to reflect the nuances and complexities of seeking health without idolizing it, seeking health without demanding it, and above all, seeking God's guidance and presence with us in all states of illness and wellness. Thank you.